The history of lynching begins with the history of America. The term lynching actually comes from an American revolutionary Colonel Lynch. And so during the Revolutionary period, Colonel Lynch, he was famous for meting out punishment on suspected British Tories. And if you were a suspected Tory, Colonel Lynch and as well as the men under his charge would summarily tar and feather you. And so the term lynching comes from Colonel Charles Lynch during the American Revolutionary period. And during this period, by and large, the individuals who would be victims of being summarily punished were white. When we get to the 1880s, the 1890s, when we're talking about black lynch victims, the intent was lethal. The intent was to expunge that person from the community. The intent was for that person's murder, right, collective murder, to be an example for others in the community. So the intent was to kill, right? The intent was lethal so that others in the community would sort of stay in line. They would stay under control. I mean, so lynching begins as a form of social control in the 1780s, 1790s. But by the 1880s, by the 1890s, and definitely into the early 20th century, lynching has become a form of racial social control, where the primary victims are African American and the primary perpetrators are white Americans. And so, again, lynching has this long history in this country, but in the modern period, it's a racialized history. In my book, Beyond the Rope, there was a lot of evidence that I could draw upon to sort of make this argument about the multifaceted black experience of lynching. But in the main, I drew on newspapers, I drew on literature, I drew on oral histories. And the reason why I draw on these particular sources is because what I was after was to try to understand how African Americans made sense of the experience of terror, right? I was really interested in how African Americans would narrate the experience of terror. Because what we have to remember is in the 19-teens, the 1920s, and the 1930s, the civil rights movement is not on the horizon. African Americans do not know, they do not understand that 20 years later, there will be a mass movement that will upend segregation in this country. It seems from the perspective of 1910 and 1920 that segregation is going to last forever. And so if this is the reality of black people, right, the perceived reality of black people in 1910, 1920, 1930, how do you make sense of the experience of terror in a way that gives hope to the next generation to keep fighting, right? To keep fighting. Don't give up just because it looks bleak right now. And so what I tried to do in the book is to try to explain how Black Americans, right, not just regular people, but artists, writers, right, how they tried to make sense of the Black experience in a way that would provide hope for the future, but provide hope for the next generation. And so what I believe I uncover in the book is this tradition that I refer to as consoling narratives of the lynched Black body. And so in the book, in Beyond the Rope, I try to tell the story of how African Americans began to conceive of lynching as not stories or simply stories of victimization, but also as stories of empowerment. And so in these, what I call consoling narratives, right, the lynched Black body is in the background. In the foreground is who those individuals were in life and how they resisted white lynch mob violence. And if you could focus there, right, if you could focus on who they were in life, how they resisted, those elements of the story could be used to give hope to, could be used to inspire the next generation to mobilize against white supremacy, to mobilize against segregation, right? And so the goal of Consoling Narratives was to create a usable past, as long as the story revolved around dead Black bodies hanging from a tree, right? That's not an empowering story. That's not a story that you can share and inspire people, empower people. And so Consoling Narratives of the Lynched Black Body were a way to move beyond the shadow of the lynching tree in a way that would inspire future action. So in the book, I focus on the story of Henry Lowry. And Henry Lowry, in many ways, I'll just say he was a victim of a lynching in Arkansas in 1920. And Lowry is important because the NAACP uses him and his case to generate a lot of attention for their anti-lynching movement, and that they were sort of getting off the ground. Began in 1916, but by 1920 the NAACP is fully enmeshed in the anti-lynching crusade. And so the Henry Lowry case was a case where they really poured their resources into trying to depict him as a victim of white supremacy, as a victim of white mob violence. And so they essentially create several news releases that really emphasize Lowry as a victim, as someone whose civil rights were stripped, someone who was burned at the stake. I don't want to get into the gory details of his lynching, but it was one of the worst in American history, witnessed by at least, from our estimates, 10,000 people in the Arkansas Delta. And so the Lowry case is a clear case, or at least in the eyes of the NAACP, of Black dehumanization. However, it was interesting to see how the Black press at the time sought to depict the case. And several publications focused in on the resistance that Lowry offered the lynch mob. They focused in on how Lowry refused to whimper. He refused to beg for his life, all to suggest his courage, his bravery, right, in the face of terror, right? And so the NAACP chose to tell a story of Black victimization because they made the calculation that that would help their efforts to secure an anti-lynching bill in Congress. The more they honed in on how Black people were powerless, how Black people were victims of white lynch mobs and lynch mobs were running amok, the more support that they anticipated that they would receive in Congress. The Black press had different goals, right? They're not trying to convince Congress to pass an anti-lynching law exclusively. They're also writing to a Black public who wants to understand, this case in more nuanced ways. And in particular, they want to understand who the victim was in life. They want to understand what did he do, right, in response to this, in response to his anticipated lynching. And so those are the details that several Black publications, namely the Chicago Defender, would sort of base their sort of depiction of the case on. And so just with that one case, right, there are two different traditions of telling the story of lynching. There is a Black victimization narrative that the NAACP believed that they needed to tell in order to get support for anti-lynching legislation. And then you have the consoling narrative that focused on Henry Lowry as a person, who he was as a man, right? The life that he lived in the community, as well as the resistance that he offered in response to this threatened lynching. And so that story is more resemblant of Consoling Narratives of the Lynched Black Body. And so you have in just one case competing narrative traditions, right? But decidedly for the Black community, telling the story of lynching was about giving hope to, right, the community, future generations, to resist white supremacy. As long as the story focused exclusively on terror, as long as it focused on dehumanized Black bodies, that story wasn't a story that would create a usable past for Black people, for Black self-determination, for Black empowerment. What I wanted to share with readers is that the Black experience of lynching changed over time. What Black people, how African Americans understood lynching changed over time given the circumstances of the times. At one moment, it's really important for the NAACP to highlight Black people as victims. At another time, it's really important for Black people to be highlighted as resisting lynching, as fighting back against lynch mobs, because of the intended rhetorical impact that it would perhaps have on the community. And so this much more complicated story of the Black experience of lynching, to my eyes, had not been told in one place. And so I wanted to tell this story as best that I could in one place. And so, the NAACP, at the time, right, because they would be in support of these consoling narratives, but at the same time, they're trying to convince white congressmen, right, to support anti-lynching legislation. They are not going to if it revolves around black people fighting back, if it revolves around black people being empowered. They're not going to support that. As long as black people were victims, hapless victims at that, in need of white support and aid, it was possible then to convince hesitant, even reluctant white congressmen to support federal anti-lynching legislation. You know, when I wrote the book, Beyond the Rope, it was really about trying to help people understand that the black experience of lynching was not one-dimensional. It wasn't simply a story of white people lynching black people. It was a story that was much more complicated than that, that includes black vigilantism, but not exclusive of. It's a story that includes black people being victims and African Americans conceiving of themselves as victims. But it's also a history where African Americans, because they wanted to create a usable past, a past that was empowering for future generations, created consoling narratives of the lynched black body at a moment, at a time where the civil rights movement was not on the horizon. And so how do you narrate the experience of terror at a moment where black people are at their lowest? And so consoling narratives become really important in that context. And so, you know, the thesis of my book, Beyond the Rope, is that the black experience of lynching is multifaceted. We've oftentimes thought about the black experience of lynching as one-dimensional, as, you know, African Americans as victims and white Americans as perpetrators. And what I do in the book is I show that at one point in time in America's history, African Americans were vigilantes, so they organized lynch mobs, but they also were victims of lynching. Right? So the history of lynching is multifaceted. At one point in time, African Americans were in support to a small degree of lynching. At another time, they are opposed to it, and they are the chief anti-lynching advocates in the country. And so what the book tries to do is to show that the black experience of lynching was multifaceted, and it changed over time, and how African Americans made sense of lynching changed over time as well. And so the book really tells this much more nuanced, much more complicated story than we have typically received. And so there's a long history of lynching in this country, but it's only up until really in the 1880s when lynching becomes decidedly racialized, meaning that the narratives to justify lynching revolve around black men and black people, and less, right, white Americans are finding themselves victims of lynching, right? In the main, right, after the 1880s, right, it's African Americans, it's Latinos who are the primary targets of lynching in this country. And so the history of lynching itself has an interesting history. It's not just a black and white history, it's a history of, what I tell my students in my classes is that, every racial group in this country has been subjected to lynching, right? But in the modern period, we really are talking about, when I say modern period, again, I mean when when lynching is beginning to emerge, let's say in the American Revolutionary period, it wasn't seen as a lethal act. People didn't think about lynching as a lethal act, and the intent was to kill, right? The intent was to embarrass. The intent was to maim or to harm. It wasn't to kill. Now, if you tar and feather someone the right way, they're going to die. But the goal wasn't to kill. Now,
You mentioned earlier, um, in that modern era of lynching, African Americans start to commit it amongst themselves in their communities. Can you go into that a little bit? How that came about?
so in my book, Beyond the Rope, I talk about the history of black vigilantism. And in many ways, when I began this project, when I began doing intensive research into lynching in the South, I knew very little about the history of black vigilantism. And so writing this book was eye-opening for me. When we think about black vigilantism in the context of the history of lynching, it's a small phenomenon by comparison. And so if there were 5,000 Americans, mostly African Americans, that were lynched in the course of American history, and the best numbers that we have are from 1880 to roughly 1960. If 5,000 Americans were lynched during that time, the majority of which are African Americans, if we were to compare the number of black people lynched by or killed summarily by other African Americans, it would be about 150 cases that we've been able to document. And so the phenomenon of black vigilantism pales in comparison to white on black vigilantism, or white on Latino vigilantism, white on Native people's vigilantism. It pales in comparison, but nonetheless, it did occur. And so what I basically document in the book, Beyond the Rope, is why it occurred. And so African Americans lynched other African Americans or engaged in vigilante violence against African Americans because they believed that the white controlled criminal justice system would not punish individuals accused of violent crimes such as rape and murder perpetuated against black people. And so what you have with particularly black Americans in the South, in the Jim Crow South, engaging in vigilantism, is this sense that, you know, the murder of a loved one, the murder of a family member would not be treated the same as the murder of a white person, as the rape of a white person, and therefore the community would step in the place of the criminal justice system and mete out punishment. And so this is a contentious point because we know that one of the main justifications for white on black vigilantism is that the criminal justice system would move too slowly, or the criminal justice system would come up or would render, the wrong verdict. And we know that was almost never true, but nonetheless, this was an argument that apologists of lynching made. With the black experience of lynching, this is really the reason that motivated black lynch mobs or black vigilantism, vigilantes to be mobilized. And so when we're talking about the black experience of lynching, when we're talking about black vigilantism, what's motivating it is this belief, and it's a well-founded belief, that the criminal justice system would not punish crimes that black people perpetuated against other black people.
Why is
the reason why white Americans refuse to punish crimes that black people perpetuated against other black people is because of this idea of social equality. We have to realize that in America at the time, black people were seen as inferior, decidedly inferior. And for a white person, for the white controlled criminal justice system to extend the same kind of rights and privileges to black people would undercut the system of segregation, it would undercut the system of white supremacy. And so any rights and privileges that a white person received by virtue of the system, black people had to be denied it if the system was going to be maintained, if the system was going to continue to perpetuate itself. And so black people could not be extended the same rights, the privileges. They could not be able to access the criminal justice system in the same way that white people could if the system of segregation was going to stand. And so this is why African Americans took the law into their own hands. It's because the properly constituted authorities were not going to do so because the system of segregation told them that they could not, right? And so black Americans, but you would think that given the number of cases that would have, that a quote unquote black lynch mob would have been mobilized, there would have been many more cases of black vigilantism, but there weren't. And so what we see with black vigilantism, it's those quote unquote alleged crimes that are beyond that pale. So instances of incest, right? Instances of rape, those instances of murdering an elderly person, those are the instances that mobilized the black community into action. It wasn't just every murder, it wasn't every rape, it really depended on who it was and their value to the community that led to black vigilantes being mobilized. And so there's a lot of nuance in what mobilized black Americans to organize vigilante justice. The point that I want to make is that it wasn't something that happened, that people engaged in easily, right? It was something that really revolved around who the individual was. It revolved around what was the severity of this alleged criminal act that all went into mobilizing a group of black vigilantes. And so, and the reason for this really brutal mass lynching or spectacle lynching is because he had allegedly murdered a white planter, one of the most powerful people in the Arkansas Delta, and so he needed to be made an example of. And so news of his lynching was shared a day before, so to make sure that there was a crowd that would be there. He was, the day of the lynching was sort of paraded through town, again, to sort of generate interest and anticipation of the lynching. And then at the actual lynching, his body is mutilated, is burned. White spectators, after he's died, come and they take body parts. It's a gory scene, right? It is an example of how black bodies were dehumanized, and it was reinforced that black people were decidedly inferior to whites because lynching had become something reserved for black people, and white people, by virtue of being white, right, were excluded from it.
So these consoling narratives, were they just for the victims of black on black lynching, or was it? I feel like it'd be most powerful for white on black lynching victims there.
So when we think about consoling narratives of the lynched black body, what we're talking about are narratives that are created to counter white on black lynching narratives. They have very little to do, if anything, to do with black vigilantism.
Thank you. All right, and then
So African Americans in general during the era of segregation put little faith in the criminal justice system. And so when an African American was alleged to have murdered a white person, was alleged to have raped a white person, many in the African American community would doubt, right, whether that was actually true. And in many cases, we know that it was false, but an African American person was at the wrong place at the wrong time, and they were they were pointed out as someone who most likely committed the crime. And in many cases, it didn't really matter which black person, just that a black person would be blamed was enough to satisfy the white community. And so African Americans put very little faith, very little stock into whites or the white controlled criminal justice system telling them that a black person was guilty of a particular crime. And because of the racial hostility, because of whites' desire to sort of jump to conclusions about a black suspect, African Americans wasted no time in trying to create competing narratives to what whites said most likely happened. And so there wasn't this sort of sense that of shame or of guilt that would have mitigated black people telling stories, empowering stories that revolved around a lynch victim. In many cases, they understood that they lived in a culture in which black people were assumed guilty, and only after a white person, particularly a white person that would have been close to a potential lynch victim or a lynch victim, would come forth and say, this person could not have ever committed this crime, right? Would maybe the white controlled criminal justice system relent, right, or release them, because that was the nature of the system. I found very little evidence to show that African Americans had a high faith in the criminal justice system, and so the posture was always to sort of be skeptical, if not simply just discount what the criminal justice system would say about alleged criminal.
Thank you.
in general. And this was the case through the early national period, through the antebellum period. But as we get closer to the modern America, and I would date a modern America beginning with the Civil War and definitely by the 1880s, the color of individuals who are being lynched is decidedly becoming darker and darker. It's becoming, lynching is becoming something that is used as being targeted towards racial minorities and specifically African American men. And this is a tradition, I would argue, we are still drawing on today. When we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, they're drawing on this tradition, even though they are probably not aware of it. And so just I think you can see a direct connection with the kinds of narratives that Black people uh, sort of talk about in relationship to police shootings of unarmed African Americans. And so those police shootings are oftentimes referred to as 21st century lynchings. And that's not an accident. That's not a rhetorical flourish. That is purposeful. That is intentional. There are many who would see the parallels between sort of, police, which seems to be systemic police brutality, police shootings of unarmed African Americans, and the state-sanctioned violence of lynching that occurred, a half a decade in the past. And so I had the opportunity to go to a public forum where Terrence Crutcher, who was a victim of, many in the community would argue police brutality, where a white officer in Tulsa shoots and kills Terrence Crutcher back in, I believe, the summer of 2016, or a little bit before the summer of 2016. And I remember attending this public forum in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where his sister, Tiffany Crutcher, begins to talk about who Terrence Crutcher was in life. And she begins her story by talking about how, during the moment where police are surrounding him and there are helicopters above and they're talking about Terrence Crutcher, the suspect, one of the policemen in the chopper above says, he looks like a bad dude. He looks like a very bad dude. And this really struck a chord in the community. This really struck a chord in Tiffany Crutcher. She actually begins her comments by relaying the story that I just told you, and she constantly comes back to it in her comments. She said, if my brother was a bad dude, then how do you explain all the community work that he did? If he was a bad dude, how do you explain that he was such a great father? If he was such a bad dude, how do you explain this was someone who was going back to school so that he could improve himself, so that he could be an even greater asset to his community? If she was a bad dude, she just, she listed probably 5 or 6 things about who he was in life to try to undermine, to try to undercut this idea that he was a bad dude. And the implication was that if he was a bad dude, then he was deserving of the fate that he received. And so in my mind, I sat there mesmerized by the story that she was telling, but also mesmerized that right in front of me was someone who was relaying a consoling narrative of the lynched Black body, trying to displace, a narrative that framed her brother as a bad dude, a dude that was deserving of police brutality or lethal, someone that deserved to be killed, and because they were quote unquote uncontrollable. And so I think you see numerous instances of African Americans reshaping, right, narratives, right, about Black victims, whether it's police brutality, and they're reshaping them into consoling narratives. So I think there's the power of this tradition is in the number of examples, right, that you can find in African American culture, as well as how relevant telling these kinds of stories still are, right, in the present. And so Tiffany Crutcher is just one example. Her sharing that story is just one example of how Black people to this day utilize consoling narratives to fend off, to undercut what I would call racist narratives um, of Black people. You know, the way in which consoling narratives of the lynched Black body manifest itself is in the number of, I would say, consoling narratives that we see occurring in African American culture. And so I would even, want to talk about the present moment, right? And so put simply, the tradition of consoling narratives of the lynched Black body is about, in many ways, trying to find a way to tell an empowering story about the experience of lynching. A story that would help the community understand who Black lynch victims were in their life and how they resisted lynch mob violence. And this story became a way to provide hope, right? And just let me back up a little bit. So in the traditional lynching narrative, right, Black people are victims. Black people experience horrific violence. Their bodies are abused. They're in many ways maimed. Their bodies are mutilated. Their bodies are hung in the public square for all to see. And so in the traditional lynching narrative, and I'll just say the white supremacist vision of the lynching narrative, Black people are dehumanized and are powerless. And this is the story that whites wanted Black people to take away from lynching, that you're less than human and that you are powerless to change, right, segregation. Segregation is the reality now, and it will be the reality for the next 100 years, 200 years. And so it took a lot of mental energy. It took a lot of perseverance for Black people to try to conceive of lynching as anything other than a story of dehumanization.